Hello everyone, it's Karina with Karina Loves to Plan. Thank you for joining me in my little corner of the internet where we talk all things planners, fountain pens, and fountain pen inks. Today I'm doing the progress report or progress update of my May currently inked. I have these all in my Hobonichi A5 notebook with 52 GSM Tomoe River paper. If you're not familiar with how I do the swatches with a Browse ornament nib in the 3mm size, which I have on a nib holder. And then alongside this, I also do doodles in my Hemlock and Oak notebook. And then I also do roses in my MeePlus Passport Planner. So I'll show you all of these and then I'll give you the ratings for each pen and ink combination. Let's get started. The first pen and ink combination is my Leonardo Momento Zero Grande 2.0 in Angel Skin. This has a 14 karat fine nib and it is inked with Diamine Blush. This was a lovely combination. I had no issues with the ink hard starting and it has beautiful shading. The ink goes from this red to a beautiful pink. So I gave the ink a 9 because it's just stunning. The flow a 10 because I love that it's above average wetness, and the comfort level a 9. So there is Diamine Blush on all the different papers. I tested on the Hemlock and Oak Archivist paper, Tomoe River paper, Rhodia, Midori. We have Iroful paper, Onion Skin, Yamamoto Bank, and Bank. And it's really interesting to me how much more orange it looks on the Onion Skin, the Yamamoto Bank, and the Bank, and then how much more pink it looks on the Iroful paper. And then for each pen and ink combination, I also do a doodle or a Zentangle. Most of these are from the Instagram account Varney Kikarni, which I will list in the description below. But I love being able to do doodles like this because it really shows off the shading qualities of the pen. Sometimes when you're just writing with a pen and ink combination, you don't really see huge pools of ink like this in corners, but then when you do doodles like this, you get to see some of those characteristics a lot more. So then I also did, let me find it here, in my MeePlus Planner, I also do a rose on this paper here, and you can see how much more coral it looks on this paper, and I just love it. But also, once these are all done, like, it's just going to sound so beautiful, that paper. So then that is my Leonardo Momento Zero Grande 2.0 in Angel Skin with Diamine Blush. The next pen and ink combination is my Sailor Hatchimonia in Kubo Sakura, and this has an 18 karat fine nib, and I have it inked with Robert Oster Copper. I wasn't sure how well these two would pair, but I truly enjoyed it. The ink had great flow out of this 18 karat fine nib, and it had a little bit of shading, but I don't need a bottle of this ink. So I gave the ink a 9 because it's just beautiful, a flow a 9, and the comfort level of the Pro Gear an 8. So there is Robert Oster Copper on all of the different papers, and it looks like it looks more purple on the Iroful paper, but then it generally looks the same across, maybe a little more pinkish red on Onion Skin, Yamamoto Bank, and the Bank papers, but still so pretty. And then when we look at the Zentangle, a little bit of the shading does come out, especially when you do those lines over and over again. And what I really liked about this one was being able to use the fine nib for those finer lines. And sometimes I choose a Zentangle based on how many of those fine lines I have to do. And if I have a finer nib, then I'm more than likely to want to do these because I love using those really fine nibs. And then when we look at the rose I've painted, really love the shading. It looks darker, I guess more saturated or more purple, I think, with these. It reminds me more of the Andryllium ink, and I'm pulling it out right now just so I remember the name of it. That Andryllium Pompadour Cotinga Burgundy reminds me of that color. So that is my Sailor Hatchimonia in Kobazakura with Robert Oster Copper. Now I have my Twsbi Eco in Espresso Bronze, and this is inked with Pilot Iroshizuku Seon Gyo, and this has an extra fine nib. Not a pairing I would have initially put together, but the flow is above average in this extra fine nib, which makes it so lovely to use. I loved using this pen and ink pairing, just a really lovely combination. So I gave the ink a 9 because it's lovely, the flow a 10 because it's above average, which I like, and the comfort level of the Eco an 8. So that's what Pilot Iroshizuku Syungyo looks like on all the different papers. And it's so interesting to me how much of a lighter purple it looks on the Tomoe River, a little bit more pink in that one, whereas this is very one-dimensional. And it's like it's trying to show sheen, but it doesn't really come off there. And then on the Rhodia paper, it just looks so saturated that it's almost black. Then on Midori paper, it looks brown rather than the purple. And then the Irofil, you really get the purple coming out here. And so interesting with the onion skin that you really can't make out that purple. It looks more brown with a tiny bit of a really light purple. And then on the Yamamoto bank, you get a bit more of that grainy, I guess, purple brown color. And then on the bank, it's a little bit more burgundy, but not a lot of sheen showing actually in this. Whereas in the original sample here, there is definitely sheen showing. I don't think I would normally like this ink if there was a lot more sheen showing on here. And then the Zentangle, this one was really fun to do. I did find though that I had to prime the nib a little bit to get the flow going. And I also am realizing that the archivist paper, while lovely, has a little bit more feedback with all of my pens. My pens feel like they're a little bit more feedbacky or even scratchy on this paper. So sometimes when I'm doing these Zentangles, I think, what is wrong with this pen? It might actually be the way that it is on this specific paper. And then when we look at the rose in my MeePlus Planner, look at the way that that shades. It's absolutely lovely. And you can see a little bit more of the sheen happening here as well. So lovely to do. So that is my Twsbi Eco in Espresso Bronze with Pilot Iroshizuku Syungyo. We now have my Walltown pens, and this is in the Strata Quartz, and I have this with an extra fine Yovo number 6 nib. This is actually from the San Francisco Pen Show nib from 2023, and I have this ink with Sailor Manyo Kuri. I love this ink so much and would have it inked every month if I could. This has lovely flow and shading, and I have no issues whatsoever. I gave the ink a 10, the flow a 10, and the comfort level of the Walltown pens a 9. I knew this ink was going to look so cool on all of these papers. I mean, look at how much purple comes out on the archivist paper, but then on the Tomoe River paper, a little bit of purple, a little bit more beige and brown happening there. The Rhodia feels a little bit one-dimensional, that it just seems to show the brown. And then on the Midori, it looks more pink mixed in with that cream. On the Irofil paper, you get to see a little bit of this grayish purple. On the onion skin, it looks orange or coral, which is so strange to me. And then the Yamamoto bank, very similar as well, with the orange or the coral coming out. And on the bank paper, look at, there's mix of like pink or purple, beigey gray brown. So interesting how this ink reacts to all the different papers. And then we have the Zentangle here. This one was a fun one to do. It was a mix of both straight lines and circles, and I really love how I've decided to create these grids slightly bigger so that I'm not spending time doing teeny tiny ones like this, even though this is so satisfying to look at. It's much more sustainable for me to do Zentangles that are slightly larger in size. And then when we look at the rose that I painted in the MeePlus Planner, look at the way that it shades here. And it even looks different to all of the different papers as well. I love this ink so much because depending on what paper you use, you don't really know how it's going to come out. Stunning, stunning. Absolutely love it. So that is my Walltown Pens Strata Quartz with Sailor Manyo Kuri. And now we have my Pelikan M1000 in Renaissance Brown. This originally came with an extra fine nib, but I had this ground down to a needlepoint by Kirk Spear. And this is inked with Esterbrook and the Coffee Monsters Co. Forgotten Iced Coffee. I wanted these two together because this is a very wet nib with a slightly drier ink, and the two were perfect together. It really found the right balance. And it also had lovely shading too. So I gave the ink a 9, the flow a 9, and the comfort level of the M1000 a 9. I've used this ink before, but I always felt like it needed a wetter nib. And then when I look at the way that this ink looks on all the different papers, it's so interesting to me. I love the way that it looks on the Archivist paper. It's got that creamy grayish brown, and then it's almost a lighter version, more beige on the Tomoe River paper. On the Rhodia, it looks like a very flat brown, not a lot of dimension to it. Whereas on the Midori, you can really see some of the chromo shading properties happening here. A little bit of coral coming out in that as well. And the Aerofil paper, it does tend to lean more gray than the brown. And then you have a lot of brown coming out on the onion skin paper, which is interesting. But then the Yamamoto Bank and Bank just look gray. So interesting to me how the ink just reacts to the different papers. And then we have the Zentangle, another one from Varney Kekarney. What I love about the Zentangles is that even if you make a mistake in one of the grids, when you look at it as a bigger picture, almost all of those little mistakes or the things that you think aren't perfect, they just blend in well and make one really beautiful doodle or drawing. So if you make a mistake with these, don't worry, because the bigger picture will almost cancel them out. So that is my Pelikan M1000 in Renaissance Brown, and it is inked with the Esterbrook and Coffee Monsters Co. Forgotten Iced Coffee. And I forgot to share the rose. Here we go. The rose definitely looks more brown on this paper in the MeePlus Planner. And there's almost a little bit of green happening on the edges here. Really beautiful, but also super interesting. And now we have my Zodiac Penco. This one's in the Capricorn model, and this is in the Bourbon and Smoke blank. And I have this with an extra fine nib, and it is inked with Sailor Manyo Ayame. This is not your typical match, but I loved this pairing. You've got the really smooth and wet extra fine nib, and the ink also had great flow and amazing shading. I want a bottle of this ink. So I gave the ink a 10, the flow a 10, and the comfort level of the Capricorn model a 10. Let's just look at how this ink reacts to all of the different papers. So it looks very similar on the Archivist and the Tomoe River paper. You've got purple and green. You don't ever know which one's going to come out. And then it's actually showing the chromo shading properties on the Rhodia paper as well as the Midori. And then on the Aerofil and the Onion, you definitely see the pink and purple and the green happening there. But on the Yamamoto Bank and the Bank, it's mostly the green that's coming out. There's hardly any purple coming out of those papers. And then when we look at the Zentangle, you can really see when there's areas of pooling or where the pen goes over the same spot multiple times, you see a lot more shading in there, and that's where the purple comes out, which is really interesting. And then when we look at the rose actually is very lovely in terms of the chromo shading happening. It looks more bluish purple and gray, and then you've got the hints of purple and green in there as well. Really, really lovely. So that is my Zodiac Penco in the Capricorn model in Bourbon and Smoke with Sailor Manyo Ayame, and I need a bottle of that ink. Next, we have my Franklin-Christoph in the Model 31 in Antique Glass, and this has an extra fine extra fine sig nib, and this is inked with Sailor Shikiori Sasabune. I love this ink. It flowed really well out of the extra fine sig nib and has really lovely shading. I am absolutely tempted to get a bottle. I gave the ink a 10 because it's just stunning, the flow a 10 because it is above average wetness, and the comfort level of the Model 31 a 9. And there's the ink on all the different papers. I mean, there isn't anything too different about the way that this paper reacts on all the papers. It looks generally the same across, also kind of consistent and slightly boring. And then we have this doodle. I loved being able to use the extra fine sig nib here because you could see that I used different line variations to create a little bit of that effect. But this one is just mesmerizing because, I mean, you take a look at this one grid, but then it creates this really big, almost confusing doodle. And then I will show you my painting, or the painting of the roses, and you can see how well this ink shades. It's just a beautiful, lovely green ink. So that is my Franklin-Christoph Model 31 in antique glass with Sailor Shikiori Sasabune. The next pen and ink combination is my Hogtown pens. This is in the Swansea large in Impressionist 1, and this has an extra fine nib as well, and this is inked with Ferris wheel press Peter Moss. This green is lovely, and it has an above average flow out of this very smooth extra fine nib. This ink shades beautifully. I gave the ink a 10 because it's stunning, the flow a 10, and the comfort level of the Swansea large a 10. And there's the ink on all the different papers. I really like how it looks on the Aerofil paper, just the smooth green, a little bit darker, but then on the Archivist it does look a little bit more yellow or olive. I really like the way that it looks on the Tomoe River paper. You've got the mix of that kind of olivey green with the darker green here. It's definitely looking more yellow on the onion skin, which is really interesting. Out of all of them, I thought that the Midori would make it look more yellow, but I think the onion skin actually makes that ink look more yellow. And then when we look at the Zentangle, again, another one from Varney Kikarni. I love the way that the ink pools in those corners to really show off the shading in that ink. And then when we look at the rose, this definitely shows off the shading as well, where it pools along the corners or where I've lifted the brush. I really love the tones of this green. So that is Ferris wheel press Peter Moss with my Hogtown pens Swansea large in the Impressionist 1. The next pen and ink combination is my Platinum 3776, and this is with Kobayashi, and this is Sugabay, and this has an 14 karat fine nib, and it is inked with Van Diemen's Overcast. I think I wrote 18K, but it's supposed to be a 14K. I loved this pairing. I did not find this ink too light. It had above average flow, but it did need some priming after long writing sessions. So I gave the ink a 10 because it just shades beautifully and is stunning. The flow a 9, and the comfort level of the Platinum a 9. This ink is so fun when you compare it across all of the different papers. It looks definitely a lot more muted on the Archivist paper, so not a lot of that chromo shading shows up. But then you go into the Tomoe River paper, you got green pooling on the edges here, and then the pink and the purple, stunning. On the Rhodia paper, it looks a little flat, like grainy, essentially. On the Midori paper, I love that the shading is coming out. Even in the writing, the shading comes out. And then the Aerofil paper also shows off the shading beautifully. The onion skin kind of flattens it out, like the chromo shading doesn't seem to be as prominent. I mean, it's still there, but it's not as, as prominent as the Tomoe River paper, for example. But then look at how green it looks on the Yamamoto Bank and the Bank paper. So interesting. And then with the Zentangle, or the doodle up here, you can see where in some of the areas where the ink is pooling, where that shading is coming across really, really nicely. And then when we look at the painting, or the rose, I love how this shades here. It just has such different hues of the pink and the green and purple. Absolutely stunning. So where did my pen go here? Oh, I put it under here. So that is my Platinum Kobayashi Sugabay with Van Diemen's Overcast. The next pen and ink combination is my Pilot Kakuno, and this is in the Periwinkle blue. This also has a fine steel nib. I love Pilot's fine nibs, and this is inked with Sailor Manyo Haha. I have tried this ink before, and then I ended up selling it, but I think I would actually buy it again. This is a great flowing ink, and it has beautiful shading. I had no issues. So I gave the ink a 10 because it is stunning, the flow a 9, and the comfort level of the Kakuno an 8. It's funny how our tastes change with ink because I've had this ink before and then I fell out of love with it, and now I'm looking at it again and it is lovely. You've got the chromo shading that's happening on all of the papers here, so you can see bits of green and blue and purple all in the different papers. Look at some of the teal that's even coming out on the Midori paper. But then on the Yamamoto bank and the bank, it definitely looks more teal than the blue that's showing here, which is really, really interesting. And then you've got the Zentangle. I really enjoyed this one because just the way that the ink flowed out of the Pilot fine nib made this whole experience very, very enjoyable. And even though I know in the individual quadrants it didn't feel like it was perfect, when you look at it as a whole, it looks really lovely. Then when I painted with Sailor Manyo Haha, you can see some of the more chromo shading that's happening here, especially in the areas that pooled. I know this isn't necessarily a paper that I write with on a day-to-day basis, but it's still so fun to see the effects of the ink here. This is definitely an ink that I would consider purchasing again and keeping in my collection again. It's funny to say that because I know I've had inks in the past where I fell out of love with them, and then I think I've tried them again and liked them again. So my taste can change, and that's absolutely fine. So that is my Pilot Kakuno with Sailor Manyo Haha. The next combination is a pen and ink pairing that I never thought I'd ever have. It is the Sailor Pro Gear in Iris Nebula, and this has a 21 karat extra fine nib, and it's inked with Pilot Iroshizuku Tsukio. Now, this was actually an ink that I said that I could not live without, and that's even surprising to me. I know that a lot of people would find that surprising because this is not an ink that I normally have, but I really do love Pilot inks, and if I were to choose a blue one, that would be it. This was a great pairing. I had no issues with the flow, but the extra fine nib felt a little scratchy or more feedbacky on the Archivist paper. So I gave the ink a 9, the flow a 9, and the comfort level of the Pro Gear an 8. So there's Pilot, Iroshizuku Tsukio, and all the different papers, and it seems to be pretty consistent across, although the onion skin is showing a little bit more of the sheen that's happening here. But I really like this blue. It's not as blue-black as Shinkai. I feel like this has a bit more character in its blue, and I really like the way that it looks on the bank paper, actually, and even on the Rofo. It's a prettier blue. And then when we look at the Doodle or the Zentangle, I really liked this one because of how fine the lines needed to be and how fine my 14K extra, or sorry, 21K extra fine nib is. The lines from far away, they all look really, really good together. But then if you look up close, they're not all exact, which is absolutely fine. And then when we look at the rose painted with this ink, you can see some of the sheening that's happening here on the edges. And I'm very grateful that this doesn't actually sheen a lot for me. Only in the ink swatches does it sheen like that. But with regular everyday writing, it seems to be okay for the sheen. So this is my Sailor Pro Gear Iris Nebula. This is the last time you are going to see it like this because I am actually sending this off to Bokumondo in Tokyo, and they are going to basically add urushi and rodin on this. I'm going to keep the finials clear, but the rest of the body is going to have urushi and rodin. And the next time I will see this will probably be in November when that's all done. So my Sailor Pro Gear Iris Nebula with Pilot Iroshizuku Tsukio. And last but not least, we have my Esterbrook Estie in Lilac. This has an extra fine nib, and it is inked with Sailor Ink Studio 150. This was so fun to use. This ink had great shading, and I had no issues with flow. I am really tempted to get a full bottle of this ink. So I gave the ink a 10 because it's beautiful, the flow a 9 because it's slightly above average, and the comfort level of the Estie a 10. So there we go, Sailor Ink Studio 150 and all the different papers. Love all the Sailor inks and even how just one of the basic, I say basic, but like their Ink Studio inks have such beautiful chromo shading properties. I love the way that it looks on the Archivist paper. It is definitely more saturated on this one. And then look at the pinks and purples and blues that are happening in here. Then I just have to draw your attention to the way that it looks on the Yamamoto bank. It looks more blue than purple, and then I feel like there's a little bit more pink happening in the onion skin. So interesting with the way that it reacts to all of these papers. And then when we look at the doodle or the Zentangle, the areas that it shades, this was really lovely to use on this paper. Now I feel like the Archivist paper does have a little bit more tooth or pull on your nib than, for example, Tomoe River paper, which is very, very smooth. This one has a little bit more pull, so you can definitely feel a bit more feedback. And I felt like there was a little bit of, I guess, hard starting with the ink here, but I feel like it was more the paper rather than the pen and ink combination itself. But really, really pretty. And then when we look at the painting, you can really see the chromo shading that's happening here. It's so fun painting with fountain pen ink on all these different papers because you could really see the chromo shading that's happening. And like, look at the purple and the pink and the blue in here. Stunning. So that is my Esterbrook Estie in Lilac with Sailor Ink Studio 150. So these are all of my pens and inks that I used for the month of May. Which do you think were my favorites? I'm just laying them out here and that's going to roll away, isn't it? And I was really surprised at myself that I didn't have any shimmer inks this month because I normally have shimmer inks. That is not going to stay. And, you know, kind of spoiler alert, I have a few more shimmers happening in June coming up here. So watch out for that. This is what happens when you have pens that don't have clips. They're going to roll off. There we go. All right, I'm just going to hold that one so that it stays. Oh, there we go. All right, so those are all the pens and inks for May. What were your thoughts on all of these different combinations? Let me know down below. All right, again, thank you all so much for watching. If you haven't yet subscribed to my channel, please do so. And don't forget to hit that like button. Thanks again and have yourselves a great day.